Yamamoto, a name forever tied to the battles that changed the Pacific. Under his command from Pearl Harbor, the lightning strike that awakened America, to the swift victories at the Java Sea and Rabaul, Japan quickly seized control of Southeast Asia. But in Midway, 1942, everything changed. Yamamoto's perfect plan collapsed, 4 Japanese carriers went down, and Japan lost command of the seas. Even in defeat, he remains remembered as the brilliant strategic mind of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the late 1932, the world entered a period of unprecedented tension. War erupted in Europe as Hitler's Nazi Germany expanded its territory with steel and bombs. In Asia, the Empire of Japan was also sinking deeper into war in China, nursing ambitions to become a power on par with the West. Tokyo's map of expansion stretched from Manchuria, Beijing, and Shanghai all the way to French Indochina. But behind the grand parades and the thunderous cries of Banzai the Emperor, Japan's leaders understood that their empire lacked one vital thing: oil. Those fuel sources were controlled by the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Western powers Japan could not subdue by negotiation. In July 1941, Washington imposed an oil embargo on Japan, almost cutting off the lifeblood of its war machine. The wheels of conflict thus began to turn so fast that nothing could stop them. Amid that whirl of survival, one man stood out, calm in appearance, but conflicted within. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet and the soul of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Born in 1,884 inches, Nagata Prefecture, he came from a samurai family and early showed intelligence and discipline. After graduating from the Naval Academy, Yamamoto was sent to study in the United States at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. His time in Boston, and later service as a naval attaché in Washington, gave him a deep understanding of America's real strength, its vast industry, organizational capacity, and the strong national spirit of the American people. He once told colleagues, "If the war lasts more than 2 years, I cannot be sure that victory will belong to Japan. What is a bin a day?" Which would be Duar. Yet the very man who understood America better than almost any Japanese officer became the architect of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. He was not a warmonger. On the contrary, Yamamoto repeatedly expressed opposition to war with the United States. But when Tokyo's government chose confrontation, he realized that if Japan had to fight, it had only one chance: to strike first, quickly, and decisively. In strategy meetings, Yamamoto declared, "If I am allowed to command, I will inflict terrible blows on the enemy in the first 6 months. After that, I cannot say what will happen." Believing that Japan could not sustain a prolonged war, Yamamoto devised a bold plan: a surprise aerial attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, aimed at crippling the Pacific Fleet for 6 months to a year. That, he believed, would buy Japan precious time to roam freely across Asia and the Pacific, consolidate its conquests, and force Washington to come to the negotiating table. Although many senior officers in Tokyo opposed the plan, calling it too risky, Yamamoto used his immense prestige to persuade them, even threatening to resign if the plan was not approved. Ultimately, his resolve prevailed. From the vision of an admiral who both admired and feared America's power, the Pearl Harbor operation was born, a strike that Yamamoto knew would ignite a life-or-death struggle between two nations and become the greatest gamble of his career. On the 7th of December 1941, Yamamoto's plan became reality. At dawn that day, aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Without any prior declaration of war, 2 waves of assaults, totaling 353 aircraft, sank 4 American battleships, damaged 4 others, and destroyed or crippled dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels. The raid also wiped out 188 aircraft and killed more than 2,400 U.S. servicemen, with 1,178 others wounded. Meanwhile, Japan lost only 64 men and 29 planes, a remarkably small cost for a blow that shocked the entire United States. Yet Yamamoto was not entirely satisfied. The U.S. Navy's main aircraft carriers, the true backbone of American naval power, were not in port that day and escaped destruction. Moreover, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force, decided to withdraw after the second wave. rather than risk a third attack that could have destroyed the fuel depots and logistical facilities. Although Yamamoto later regretted Nagumo's cautious decision, he adhered to the Japanese military tradition of not punishing field commanders for decisions made in battle. Tactically, Pearl Harbor was a brilliant victory, but strategically, politically, and psychologically, it was a disaster for Japan. The surprise, undeclared attack infuriated the United States, awakening a wave of outrage and an unyielding determination for revenge among the American people. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called December 7 a date which will live in infamy, and soon after, the United States declared war on Japan. Yamamoto, who had once lived in America, understood better than anyone that his strike had awakened a sleeping giant and ignited the enormous fighting spirit of a great power. Before the war, Yamamoto had made a cold prediction. If I am forced to fight, for the first 6 months to a year, I will run wild. But I have no confidence at all for the second and third years. That prophecy proved astonishingly accurate. During the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept to victory across the Pacific. Under Yamamoto's command, the Imperial Navy dominated the seas. Within days of the attack, Japan seized Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong, defeated British forces in Malaya, and quickly established control over Southeast Asia. In February 1942, the fortress of Singapore collapsed. By May, Japan had completed its conquest of the Philippines, eliminating America's last foothold in East Asia. At that moment, the Japanese Empire seemed to have achieved its dream of the Southern Resource Zone, a region rich in oil and rubber. These rapid victories intoxicated Tokyo's military leadership, who believed that the United States or Britain would soon lose morale and agree to peace negotiations. But, just as Yamamoto feared, America did not waver. On the contrary, the United States swiftly rebuilt and prepared to strike back. In April 1942, American bombers carried out the daring Doolittle raid, dropping bombs on Tokyo. Although the material damage was minor, the psychological blow was immense, proving that Japan was no longer safe even on its own homeland. The raid gave Yamamoto the opportunity to persuade Japan's Imperial General Headquarters that the time had come for a decisive battle with the U.S. Navy. If America still refused to negotiate, he would lure its main fleet into a final, all-out confrontation, a battle he hoped would crush the enemy's resistance once and for all. This plan led directly to the Battle of Midway, one of the most fateful turning points of World War II. According to Yamamoto's calculations, the coral atoll of Midway, the last American outpost guarding Hawaii, would be the perfect bait to force the U.S. fleet to leave its base and fight. Once the Americans were drawn into the Central Pacific, Japan's Navy would unleash its full might in a decisive blow, annihilating the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers and securing total control of the Pacific Ocean. Yamamoto mobilized nearly the entire might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His complex battle plan was divided into several coordinated operations. A small diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands in the north to mislead the enemy, while the main fleet consisting of 4 heavy aircraft carriers and dozens of escorting warships would secretly advance toward Midway. If Midway fell, Yamamoto believed the Americans would inevitably dispatch their remaining carriers to counterattack. And that would be the perfect moment for Japan's reserve forces to strike and annihilate the USS. Fleet once and for all. On paper, Yamamoto held every advantage. His fleet outnumbered the enemy 2-to-1, 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, while the Americans had only 3 carriers and a handful of escorts. He believed that only an unforeseen event could cause his plan to fail. And tragically, that event came to pass. Thanks to the efforts of U.S. cryptanalysts who had broken Japan's JN-25 naval code, American intelligence knew Yamamoto's entire plan, the timing, direction of attack, and even the Aleutian feint meant to draw them away. Instead of walking into the trap, Admiral Chester Nimitz and the U.S. Pacific Fleet turned the tables and prepared an ambush of their own. At dawn on the 4th of June 1942, the Battle of Midway erupted. From above, American dive bombers swooped down with the sun at their backs, catching the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment in the middle of rearming and refueling their planes. In less than an hour, Yamamoto's 4 main carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiryu, were engulfed in flames and sank beneath the waves. These were the same ships that had brought Japan glory at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. With his carrier air power destroyed, Yamamoto still commanded a formidable battleship force. He attempted to regroup and launch a counterattack, but his formations were scattered too far apart, while the Americans, refusing to be drawn into a night battle, Japan's traditional strength withdrew in good order. Realizing the situation was hopeless, Yamamoto reluctantly ordered a retreat. The Battle of Midway ended in one of the greatest defeats in modern Japanese history. 4 aircraft carriers, more than 250 veteran pilots, and Japan's naval initiative, all lost in less than a single day. Yamamoto's own 6-month prophecy that Japan could dominate for half a year before America overtook it had come true in the harshest possible way. From that moment, the tide of the Pacific War turned. Japan lost the initiative, and the United States began its counteroffensive. Although Yamamoto retained his post as commander-in-chief, his prestige suffered greatly. Once known as a daring and bold strategist, he was now forced into a defensive posture, fighting merely to delay the inevitable. The final months of his life were tied to the bloody Guadalcanal campaign, a grinding struggle that lasted half a year. In August 1942, U.S. forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, triggering fierce and continuous battles on land, at sea, and in the air. Yamamoto committed Japan's remaining elite forces in a desperate bid to retake the strategic island. The Imperial Navy launched ferocious counterattacks, leading to major engagements such as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, August 1942, and the Battle of Santa Cruz, October 1942, as well as numerous brutal clashes around the waters, later known as Iron Bottom Sound, the Sea of Iron, where dozens of ships from both sides now rest on the ocean floor. But despite the fierce fighting, Japan's strength was being eroded day by day. America's overwhelming advantages in industry, manpower, and logistics gradually crushed the Japanese war effort. By early 1943, with losses mounting beyond recovery and encirclement imminent, the Japanese High Command was forced to order a withdrawal from Guadalcanal. Yamamoto watched in silence as his own grand campaign unraveled. The island he had once regarded as Japan's final defensive line had fallen to the Americans, marking the moment when Japan shifted irreversibly onto the defensive. After this string of defeats, Yamamoto was exhausted physically, mentally, and spiritually. To restore morale among his troops, he decided to personally visit the front lines. He planned an inspection tour across the South Pacific to encourage his men and show that their commanders still stood with them. Yet that very decision would seal his fate. On an April morning in 1943, Yamamoto stepped into what would become the final chapter of his life. At dawn on the 18th of April 1943, a thin veil of mist hung over Rabaul, Japan's largest naval base in the South Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, accompanied by his staff officers, boarded 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. The purpose of the trip was to inspect forward airfields across the Solomon Islands, where fighting had grown increasingly intense. Known for his strict punctuality, Yamamoto appeared immaculate in full uniform and white gloves, boarding the plane precisely on schedule. The 2 Betty bombers lifted off, flying low over Bougainville Island, escorted by a 6M, 0 fighters calm and routine, like so many of his previous tours. But in the deceptively peaceful sky above, fate was already waiting. The Americans knew every detail of his journey. Thanks to the radio intelligence operation codenamed Magic, U.S., cryptanalysts had intercepted a message sent from Rabaul, one that revealed the exact date, time, flight path, and escort details of Yamamoto's mission. When the report reached Washington, President Roosevelt reportedly gave a short, chilling order: get him. A top-secret plan was set in motion, Operation Vengeance. The name said it all. This was retribution for Pearl Harbor, more than a year after the day of infamy that had shaken the United States. That morning, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal. Flying at extremely low altitude, just a few dozen meters above the sea, they covered over 600 kilometers to avoid detection by Japanese radar. Each pilot knew this was no ordinary mission. They were not to attack bases or ships, but to hunt down a single man. Around 9 a.m., under the blazing Bougainville sun, 2 black specks appeared on the horizon. The 2 Betty bombers, flying exactly as expected. One of them carried Yamamoto. The American pilots split formation, accelerated, and suddenly rose above the clouds before diving toward their targets. The dogfight lasted only moments. Streams of .50 caliber bullets tore through the air, slicing into the Japanese bombers. The Betty carrying Yamamoto trailed thick black smoke, rolled sharply, and plunged nose first into the dense jungle below. The second plane, carrying Chief of Staff Matome Ugaki, was also shot down and crashed into the sea, but Ugaki miraculously survived and was rescued by Japanese forces. The next morning, a Japanese search team traced the emergency signal deep into the jungles of Bougainville. When they arrived, they found the Betty bomber burned to a charred wreck among the fallen trees. Not far away, they discovered Yamamoto's body, still seated, thrown clear of the fuselage. His seatbelt was fastened, his white-gloved hand still gripping the hilt of his katana, the symbol of honor and loyalty. His face was calm, his head slightly bowed, as if he were lost in unfinished thoughts. The post-mortem report stated that Yamamoto had been struck by two .50 caliber bullets. One entered from behind his left shoulder, and the other traveled upward through his jaw and had a fatal wound that killed him instantly. Japan kept all details secret. On the radio, the public was told only that Admiral Yamamoto had died heroically in the line of duty. His death was an enormous psychological blow to the nation. To the Japanese people, Yamamoto was more than a commander. He was the embodiment of the Navy's pride and strength. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral and awarded the Emperor's highest military honors. His ashes were brought back to Tokyo aboard the battleship Musashi, the last flagship he had commanded. On the 5th of June, 1943, a grand state funeral was held. Along Tokyo's avenues, thousands of citizens stood in solemn silence, bowing their heads as the funeral procession passed by. In countless humble homes, portraits of Yamamoto were placed beside the photographs of sons who had fallen in battle together, forming a shared symbol of a generation consumed by war. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance was the long-awaited act of retribution. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had awakened the sleeping giant, was now dead. He became the highest-ranking Axis officer deliberately targeted and killed by the United States during the entire Second World War. That fact alone shows how deeply the Americans respected and feared him as one of their most formidable adversaries. And yet, the great irony is that Yamamoto himself understood better than anyone that war with the United States was an unwinnable gamble. He entered the conflict not out of ambition, but out of duty. And he died, witnessing his darkest predictions come true. The early triumphs, Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, never filled him with pride. They filled him with dread. He knew that every bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor would only harden America's resolve. And indeed, from Midway to Guadalcanal, one defeat after another dragged both the Japanese Empire and Yamamoto himself into a spiral of destruction. Isoroku Yamamoto lived and died as one of history's great gambles. A brilliant strategist who understood both the terrifying power of his enemy and the limits of his own nation, yet still placed his faith, his honor, and his very life into a war he knew could not be won.